All right, how y'all doing? This is Captain Borax here. Hey, listen, I'm down in Provo, Utah. I thought I'd do a little quick thing, very abridged version of how the whole Gary Gilmore thing went down. So Gary Gilmore moved to the Orem, Provo area. They kind of bleed together. It's kind of like Lehigh and American Fork. He moved here in April of 1976. He had lived in the Portland, Oregon area forever and had spent most of his life in and out of boys' schools and prison, actually, until he was 35 in 1976, mostly for armed robbery and a lot of car theft when he was younger. And he'd been let out on probation twice, and as soon as he was let out in Oregon, he got stuck right back in the pokey for robbing stores, stealing beer, stealing cars. And in 1976 of April, he was let out conditionally on the idea that he move in with someone, relative or somebody he knew that was a little more, involved within the community. And so he moved to the Orem area, moved into his cousin Brenda Nichols' house and her husband John, and he lived there for a short period of time. And he was really only on the loose in the area for about 3 months before he got stuck back in prison at the point of the mountain in Draper in 1976, in July of 1976, after committing 2 different murders on 2 separate nights in a row. One of a gas station attendant named Max Jensen in Orem. The gas station's no longer there. And Gary robbed the store and took him into one of the bathrooms and forced him to lay down and just shot him in the back of the head and took off with a small amount of cash. Gary had recently bought a white Ford pickup truck from a local dealership, and the guy had been putting a lot of pressure on him to make sure you make your payments, and Gary had hooked up with a young girl. Well, she was a woman. She was 19 years old, but she'd been divorced, already had 2 kids. Her name was Nicole Barrett Baker, and he'd been staying with her off and on as well in a little town called Spanish Fork, which is south of here, heading up towards Price Canyon. Coincidentally, on the other side where Bundy said that he buried a couple of girls out there, Susan Curtis, on the way down to Green River, Utah, which is a little town on the other side of the canyon. But anyway, this street is called 300 South, and so basically this is the second night, July 20th. He had been bouncing around from living with his cousin Brenda to living with Nicole, as well as to living with his uncle Vern D'Amico, who owned a shoe repair shop called Vern's Beehive Shoe Repair, and I'll show you that here too in a second. But so there's a motel right around the corner here. It's now called the Provo Inn, but back in 1976 it was called the City Center Motel, excuse me. And that's where he robbed this guy named Benny Bushnell. He was the front desk clerk. Good Mormon people. They had a young baby. The family lived behind the desk. There's an apartment behind it. And Gary pulled this little stunt. And it's kind of weird, right? Because Vern, his Uncle Vern, lived right next to it. And I'll show you that as well in a second. But basically, Gary pulled this little stunt where he parked his truck. Turned out it wouldn't start, something to do with the thermostat. And all of this supposedly went down at like 9 o'clock at night. And he parked it in a nearby garage. A guy named Norm Fulmer had a garage called Penny's right on the corner of University Avenue and 300 South here. I'll show you that in a second as well, because it's still there too. It's kind of weird. But he pulled it into the garage, and I don't know why the garage was open so late. The time, I got to wonder about the times a little bit. I've been taking a lot of this information from the Executioner Song by Norman Mailer, which is a fantastic book. It's the biggest, craziest book I've ever seen. Look at this thing. Absolutely insane. But I read the whole thing. Fascinating read. But the reason I'm doing such an abridged version of this is because there's so many social things going on in this book, and you kind of get a really strong viewpoint from Norman Mailer's point of view of what Gary was all about. I mean, the guy was an alcoholic. He was a career criminal. He just had a really hard time fitting into society. But anyway, the motel is still there. It's right around the corner. He came in there, he parked the truck at the garage and said, "Hey, look, can you guys take a look at the thermostat? It won't start or whatever." And they said, "Sure." And he walked right down the street, right past his Uncle Vern's house, where he also lived for a short amount of time. Went into the hotel. I keep calling it a hotel, but it's really a motel. And he went behind the desk, robbed Benny Bushnell, shot him in the back of the head, and hot-footed it out of there with a cash box with no more than $100 in it. Supposedly, the place did not have to keep any money on the premises after a certain amount of time, and they told the police that they only had, you know, maybe less than $100 and no more than $100. But he grabbed that, walked back up towards his truck where it was parked at Norm Fulmer's, and chucked the cash box in some bushes and shot himself in the hand. And when he went inside, he actually, Norm saw him, and he had been listening to the police scanner as well, and he had, someone at this restaurant right next to the motel had called the police. Benny's wife had come out from the apartment and found him bleeding from the head, laying face down on the ground. And she also called the police because the phone was ringing as well, like the front desk phone was just blowing up. And basically, by the time he got to the garage, Norm was asking him, "What's the matter with your hand?" "Oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. I cut myself." But he had dumped the gun in the bushes and had shot himself. And he got in on the passenger side, backed the truck out, and he was so nervous that he backed right into this bar that was guarding the drinking fountain right behind the bar. And what's kind of funny is supposedly the gas station was torn down, but I just looked, it's still there. At least part of it's still there, and it's right on the corner. But let's go take a peek, check it out. So it's 300 South, and there is the City Center Motel. I'm gonna pull in here, turn it around. Oldish part of town. All right, so this is the old City Center Motel. It's funny, I came here one time a long time ago and tried to get some pictures, and I got thrown off the property. But there was also reports that came from this restaurant right here, which was there as well at the time. It's still a diner. Now it's called Nate's Diner. But yeah, Benny lived in that apartment in the second window back there, he and his wife, and yep, that's where he got shot. He was killed, and he hot-footed it out there with less than $100. Now, supposedly what he did is he walked up to the gas station up here on the corner and dumped his gun along the way. But his Uncle Vern lived behind that where that building is, that attorney's office right there. That is an addition. You can see Vern's house is still there, where Gary lived. Let's see. So you can see the old house right there. Right there, that's where Vern lived, and Gary lived there for a time. But somewhere along the way here, Gary dumped his gun, shot himself in the hand. And this is the site of Fulmer's gas station where he parked his truck and asked them to take a look at it. And then when he walked back, got it, drove away, and tried to escape. Okay, so this is University Avenue in Provo. Vern's Beehive Shoe Repair Shop is actually now a nightclub. The place is still there. same site. It's called Club Velour, and there's been quite a posse of bands that have come through here in recent years that you may have heard of. One is called the Neon Trees, the Used, and Imagine Dragons. They've all kind of cut their teeth here, and this is probably the only real venue in town in the last 15-20 years, but it happens to be the site of Vern's shoe shop where Gary worked for a small amount of time. But I thought I'd do this in the car and just kind of tell you about it for a second before I got outside, because it's kind of noisy, but let's go check it out. Very busy street, downtown Provo. I have to check out that bike when I'm done here. Can't see shit. There you go. This is Vern's old shoe store. Shoe repair shop, I should say. Downtown Provo. Okay, this is 292 North and 900 West in Orem, Utah. Gary Gilmore was conditionally released from prison in Oregon if he would move into a relative's house. And so he came here. His cousin Brenda Nichols lived here with her husband John. He lived here off and on for a couple of weeks before moving in with his girlfriend Nicole, and also on and off with his Uncle Vern, who lived down in Provo. He was executed on January 17th of 77, and he was only really out and about for about 3 months or so. When he was killed in the Draper Point of the Mountain prison. Back in those days, they used a firing squad, and what's significant about Gary is that he was the first person in the U.S. that was executed in 10 years, and it was because a couple of laws had been mandated. In 1972, there was a law called Furman versus Georgia mandate on June 29th of 72 that overturned the death penalty. And then in 1976, there was another one called Gregg versus Georgia, and then it reinstated the death penalty in the U.S. And that's what's kind of significant about Gary. He was the first person who was executed in 10 years in the U.S., and he killed 2 people, but what's interesting is the guy didn't want to live at all. He tried to commit suicide twice within a month, the first time on November 16th and the second time on December 16th of 76 before they actually did it. And they used a 5-man firing squad in an old apple orchard behind the, well, a shed really, just kind of makeshift shed. It was like a food pantry thing behind the prison at the point of the mountain in Draper, which I'll show you here in a minute. And they did a 5-man firing squad, and it's kind of funny, some of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department guys were actually involved in it. I believe that Robert Hayward was actually on the firing squad, and he's the guy that arrested Ted Bundy August 16th of 1975. They used 30-30 Winchesters, and the way they did it is they had a 5-man squad. They all shoot through a series of holes in a tarp and shot at a target that was on his shirt. And the idea was that one person would have a rifle full of blanks and 4 of the guys would have live rounds. But Gary's brother, who later acquired his inmate shirt with the target on it, said there were 5 holes in it. You know, that's what he claims. I don't know how true it is, but this is kind of interesting. But this is where he landed in April of 1976.